Hi everyone, I'm here today to explain to you this heat pump thermostat, how a heat pump works, what is auxiliary heat, and what is emergency heat on it. First, I'm going to go over about how a heat pump works on the heat pump thermostat. Heat pumps are pretty much about like air conditioners, except when you switch them into heat mode, it's got a reversing valve in it. Instead of bringing the cold air in and the warm air out like it does in the summertime, it's going to bring the warm air in the cool air and pump the cool air out. Even though it is cold outside, like down in the 50s, 40s, 30s, even in the 20s, there is some warm air left in the atmosphere. So what it's going to do is it's going to pump the heat from out of the atmosphere, bring it in through the coils and through the refrigerant, and bring it inside to warm the house up. That's how a heat pump works. And what will happen is, instead of draining water out from the condensation outside, there's going to be frost that will build up on your coils on the heat pump. And when it does, it's going to eventually get frozen. So what will happen is your heat pump is going to, and the reverse valve is going to switch over into an air conditioning mode like it does in the summer, and that will lead to a defrost cycle. It will do that to warm the coils up outside on your unit and to melt the frost off of them. And what will happen is, it'll be like in the summertime, it'll blow cold air through your vents. What will happen is it will have a backup heater inside like if you have a split unit or like an indoor unit and the outdoor condenser, the indoor unit will have heat strips inside the air handler. And on the package unit, they'll be in the air handler in there. What will happen is it'll turn that on to offset the help balance out from being in air condition. It still will feel cool through the vents. I mean, it's not really cold, but just think of it, you blowing out your mouth and it through, like you blow out your mouth like that. That's 98.6, and that feels cold to the touch of the skin. So it'll blow cool air, and what will happen is it'll do that until, the defrost cycle ends. And the defrost cycle can last anywhere from about a minute to 10 minutes. Depending on how old or new your unit is, like my York unit outside, it's got demand defrost, so it'll only go into defrost when it's needed. Some of your units have about like a 90-minute defrost, so no matter if there's ice on the coils, if there's not ice on the coils or frost on them, it's going to cut into defrost no matter what, and it probably won't last as long as there's none. But this one has demand defrost, so it'll go into defrost when it's needed only. And then when it's done defrosting, it'll go back. You'll hear the swishing noise back in which is the reversing valve, and it'll cut it back into heating cycle. Your auxiliary heat will turn off, which is your heat strips in the air handler, and it'll go back into heating, and it will no longer be in air conditioning mode. It'll be in the heat pump mode. Another thing I'm going to explain is what is auxiliary heat. Auxiliary heat is, like I said earlier, it's the heat strips or the electric furnace put inside your air handler and are in your package unit in the air handler in there. What it is just think of the coils inside of a toaster. That's what they're like. They're bigger ones. And what will happen is its main purpose is for two things. One, if the heat pump goes into defrost, it'll turn on there, like I explained earlier, to help balance out it from being in the air conditioning mode while it defrosts. And two, its main purpose is, like it was the other night, it got down to like 12. And what happens is the heat pump will have a harder time keeping up when it gets colder outside because there's not as much warm air left in the atmosphere. Instead of blowing warm, it's probably going to blow lukewarm. It's going to feel colder to the touch. But what will happen is when it gets down in the lower teens and it gets down in the single digits around 0 or below 0, what's going to happen is it's going to have an auxiliary heat mode on the thermostat. On this one, it'll say aux heat on. On the older thermostats, it'll have a light that'll indicate an auxiliary heat mode, and it will turn on to help assist the heat pump in the extreme cold. and it'll run until it gets the temperature back up to the satisfied temperature, and then after that the auxiliary heat strips will turn off and the heat pump will still run, and then the heat pump will kick off if it needs to be turned off from at the satisfied temperature. And that's going to prevent it from like dropping down like the 67, 66, or 65, because in the wintertime, if you got your heat pump, let's say it's down to 0 outside or in the single digits, and you turn it up to 68, and then on a morning it's down to like 64 or 63, a lot of times your heat pump's still working, but that's an indicator that your heat strips aren't working in the air handler, and that would need to be fixed, because that's what its main purpose is for. And that's why you need heat strips. But the only thing about your heat strips is you don't want them running all the time, because if it runs all the time, as your main heat source, it's going to run your electric bill up because it burns more wattage than it does than the heat pump alone. But you will need them when it's really cold outside. These thermostats will tell it to come on when it's needed to be, as assisting the heat pump. And another thing I'm going to go into is what you'll see in emergency heat mode right here. And people are going to ask, well, what is an emergency heat mode? Emergency heat mode is to only be used during emergencies on a heat pump. Let's say, for example, it's to be used when, let's say that your heat pump defrost board's messed up, it won't defrost, or if your compressor goes out, that's when you switch it into emergency heat. Let's say in the middle of the night you're cold and your heat pump's messed up and nobody's able to come out until the next day or two. What you would do is you flip it into emergency heat, and what it does, it'll bypass the heat pump and it'll go straight into the heat strips and in the air handler, and they'll put out heat that way. It does put out some good warm hot air, but the one thing about it is, like I said earlier, you don't want those running all the time, because if it runs all the time, you're going to have a very high electric bill. That's just to get you by until you can get an HVAC guy or a technician out to look at your heat pump and to fix the problem out of that. And one thing that I see most people ignorantly do, I see videos on YouTube about it also, is people mistake emergency heat as, well, it's cold outside, the heat pump won't keep up, I'm just going to shut this heat pump off and put it in the emergency heat. That's not what it's for. That is bad advice. I would not take it. Even when it's extremely cold, just leave it in heat, let the heat pump do its thing, and what will happen is the auxiliary heat, which is similar to the emergency, which is pretty much emergency heat, it will automatically turn on to assist the heat pump. If you switch to emergency heat, you're not going to have your heat pump running. And you just leave it in heat, even when it's really cold. The heat strips will turn on when it's needed. And you actually get more heat out of it with the heat pump and the auxiliary heat, the heat strips running. So that's how all that works. And this is how you pretty much operate a heat pump. Another thing I will go over, one last thing I'll go over on this heat pump is, there's people out there, you can't treat it like a gas unit, because some people I know at nighttime with their gas unit, they could turn it down to 60 and let the house be cool, and then they wake up in the morning and they can turn it back up to 68 and it'll heat it up pretty quickly. With a heat pump, you don't want to do that, because what will happen is that auxiliary heat will turn on. Let's say you have this thermostat set down to 60 at night, and then you want to turn it up to 70 in the morning. What will happen is you'll have that auxiliary heat turn on, and what it will do is it will help get the temperature up faster in the house. But like I said, you're not saving any money doing that, because those heat strips will burn a hole for your wallet on your electric bill, because it burns a lot more kilowatts than the heat pump itself will. But some people suggest maybe just bump it up a degree at a time, but truly I think the best thing to do is just put it on a temperature that you're satisfied with all year round, or maybe not mess with it more than a degree or two. But that's something you'll have to talk to your local electric company about to see if it's worth messing with that. But that's pretty much all the information I have on how a heat pump works. This one right here, I think this is the Honeywell Pro 3000, And I notice on this thing, if you get it up more than 2 degrees, it'll cut the auxiliary heat on. Some of the other older thermostats you can get away with, like the one I used to have on here, it had the lights, it had the blue, it had the green for auxiliary heat, it had the red for emergency heat, and what it will do is it'll come on with us within 2 or 3 degrees of the temperature it's on right now. But every one of them works differently. But that's pretty much all the information I have on how a heat pump works. And thank you very much for watching the video. I hope this helps you out. Y'all have a wonderful day.